The scent of fresh bread drifted through the dusty streets of Bitterroot, Montana Territory in the summer of 1876, and Molly Hayes stood outside the bakery window with 3 pennies clutched in her swollen, work-worn hand, knowing it would not be enough to buy even half a loaf. Her stomach had been empty since yesterday morning, and the gnawing hunger made her feel lightheaded in the afternoon heat. She was a plump woman despite her poverty, with soft curves that her threadbare calico dress could not hide, and rosy cheeks that spoke of hardier days before her father had died and left her with nothing but debts. The baker, Mr. Schultz, was a stern German man who ran his shop with iron efficiency, and Molly knew from experience that he would not extend credit to a woman with no family and no prospects. She pressed closer to the window, watching the golden loaves cool on their racks, each one representing a meal she could not afford. Her mouth watered at the sight of the crusty exterior, imagining the soft white interior that would fill her belly and quiet the constant ache. 3 pennies. She had earned them by taking in mending from Mrs. Peterson, spending hours by candlelight repairing torn hems and replacing buttons, squinting until her eyes burned. 3 pennies for 6 hours of work. "You going in, or you just going to fog up my windows all afternoon?" Mr. Schultz called from the doorway, his thick accent making the words sound harsher than perhaps he intended. Molly stepped back, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I was just looking, sir. I apologize." "Looking does not pay my bills," he said, though his expression softened slightly as he took in her thin frame and the way her dress hung loose in places where it should have been snug. "You have money?" She opened her palm to show him the 3 pennies. "I know it is not enough for a whole loaf, but perhaps you have some day-old bread or rolls that did not sell yesterday?" Mr. Schultz shook his head. "My bread does not go stale. Everything sells. A loaf costs 7 pennies, miss. Come back when you have the full amount." The dismissal stung, though Molly knew he was simply running his business. She turned away from the bakery, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in public. The main street of Bitterroot stretched before her, lined with false-fronted buildings that promised prosperity to those who could afford it. The saloon, the general store, the land office, the hotel, all places where money changed hands and business was conducted. She had no place in any of them. She had been living in a small room above the laundry for the past 3 months, ever since her father's creditors had taken their house and everything in it. The room cost her $2 a month, which she earned by helping Mrs. Chen with the washing and ironing 6 days a week. It was backbreaking work that left her hands red and raw, her back aching, and her arms trembling with exhaustion. But it was honest work, and it kept a roof over her head. The problem was that after paying for her room, she had almost nothing left for food. She ate sparingly, stretching every penny as far as it would go. Potatoes when she could afford them, sometimes a bit of bacon fat to add flavor to boiled water for soup. She had lost weight at first, her dresses growing loose, but her body seemed to have settled into a new normal, holding on to every calorie with desperate efficiency. She remained soft and curved, her body refusing to become gaunt despite her circumstances. As she walked away from the bakery, lost in thoughts of hunger and desperation, she did not notice the man watching her from across the street. Nathaniel Crane stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle and arms thick with muscle earned from years of trapping in the mountains. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered from countless seasons exposed to wind and sun. He wore buckskin pants and a cotton shirt that strained across his chest, with a knife at his belt and a rifle slung across his back. He'd come down from the high country 3 days ago with a winter's worth of furs to sell, and his pockets were heavy with gold coins. He had noticed Molly the moment she approached the bakery window. There was something about the way she moved, a grace despite her obvious hunger, and a dignity in the way she held herself, even as she stood outside looking in. He had been about to enter the general store when he saw the baker turn her away, had seen the way her shoulders slumped for just a moment, before she straightened her spine and walked away with her head held high. Nathaniel was a man of action, not words. He had lived most of his adult life alone in the mountains, with only the wind and the wildlife for company. He came to town twice a year to trade his furs and stock up on supplies, and then he returned to his cabin in the high country where the air was clean and the silence was profound. He had little use for society, and even less for the social graces that governed town life. But something about the woman in the faded calico dress called to him in a way he could not explain. Perhaps it was the contrast between her obvious poverty and her quiet dignity. Perhaps it was the soft curves of her body that spoke of gentleness and comfort. Perhaps it was simply that he recognized a fellow survivor, someone who faced hardship without complaint and kept moving forward because there was no other choice. He crossed the street with long strides, his moccasins silent on the packed dirt, and entered the bakery before he could question his impulse. Mr. Schultz looked up from behind his counter, his expression shifting to one of cautious welcome. Mountain men like Nathaniel Crane were known to have money, and they spent it freely when they came to town. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you today?" Nathaniel looked around the bakery, taking in the rows of bread, the shelves of rolls and pastries, the glass case displaying cakes and pies. The warm, yeasty smell filled the small space, and he could see why the woman had been drawn to the window. "How much for everything?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate from somewhere in his chest. Mr. Schultz blinked, uncertain he had heard correctly. "Excuse me. Everything in this shop. How much would it cost to buy it all?" The baker's eyes widened, and he quickly began calculating, his fingers moving as he tallied up the inventory. "Well, let me see. I have 20 loaves of bread, 3 dozen rolls, 4 pies, 2 cakes, and various pastries. That would be approximately $15, sir." Nathaniel pulled a leather pouch from his pocket and counted out 15 gold coins, placing them on the counter one by one. Each coin made a satisfying clink as it joined the others, and Mr. Schultz's expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment. "I want it all delivered to that woman who was just here," Nathaniel said, nodding toward the door. "The one in the blue calico dress. Do you know where she lives?" Mr. Schultz hesitated, his merchant's instincts warring with his curiosity. "I believe she lives above the Chinese laundry, sir. But may I ask why you are doing this?" "No," Nathaniel said simply. "Just make sure she gets it. Every loaf, every roll, every pastry. And tell her." He paused, trying to find words for something he did not fully understand himself. "Tell her it is paid for." He turned and walked out of the bakery before Mr. Schultz could respond, leaving the baker staring at the pile of gold coins and shaking his head in wonder. Nathaniel did not return to his room at the boarding house. Instead, he found himself wandering the streets of Bitterroot, his eyes scanning the buildings and alleyways as if searching for something. He told himself he was simply familiarizing himself with the town, noting which businesses had expanded since his last visit and which had closed. But in truth, he was looking for another glimpse of the woman in the blue dress. He found her an hour later, carrying a basket of laundry up the external stairs that led to the rooms above the Chinese laundry. She moved slowly, pausing every few steps to rest, and he could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. Without thinking, he crossed the street and called out to her. "Miss, let me help you with that." Molly turned, startled, and nearly lost her grip on the heavy basket. She found herself looking up at the largest man she had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun and eyes as dark as mountain lakes. For a moment, fear fluttered in her chest. She was alone and vulnerable, and this stranger could easily overpower her. But then she met his gaze and saw nothing but genuine concern, and her fear eased. "That's very kind of you, sir, but I can manage," she said, though her trembling arms suggested otherwise. Nathaniel reached out and took the basket from her hands before she could protest further. It weighed at least 30 pounds, full of wet laundry that needed to be hung to dry, but he lifted it as easily as if it were empty. "Where are you taking this?" Molly hesitated, torn between proper caution and practical necessity. Her arms were aching, and the thought of not having to carry the basket up 2 more flights of stairs was almost irresistible. "To the roof," she said finally. "There are lines up there for drying." He nodded and began climbing the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, while she followed more slowly behind him. When they reached the roof, he set the basket down near the clotheslines and waited while she caught her breath. "Thank you," she said, studying him more carefully now. He was unlike any man she had encountered in Bitterroot. His clothes were different, his bearing was different, even the way he stood seemed to speak of wide open spaces and untamed wilderness. "You're very kind to help a stranger." "It was no trouble," he said, and then, because he was not good at small talk and did not know what else to say, he added, I saw you at the bakery earlier. Molly's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Oh, yes, well, I was just looking. I have a weakness for fresh bread, I'm afraid. Nothing weak about being hungry, Nathaniel said bluntly. Man needs food to survive. Woman, too. His directness was oddly refreshing after the subtle judgments and pitying looks she had endured from others in town. That is true, she admitted, but unfortunately, food costs money, and money is something I have very little of at present. That might change soon, he said, and before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his head in a gesture that was half nod, half bow, and headed back down the stairs. Molly stood on the roof, watching his broad back disappear, wondering what he had meant and why her heart was beating faster than the climb alone could account for. She found out an hour later when Mr. Schultz appeared at her door, accompanied by two young men carrying crates filled with baked goods. The baker looked flustered and slightly bewildered, but he directed the young men to set the crates inside her small room while Molly stared in complete shock. I do not understand, she said, looking at the abundance of bread and pastries that now filled nearly every available surface in her tiny space. There must be some mistake. No mistake, miss, Mr. Schultz said, pulling a small ledger from his pocket to consult his notes. A gentleman came into my shop this afternoon and purchased my entire inventory with instructions to deliver it all to you. He paid in full, $15 in gold. Molly felt the blood drain from her face. $15. That was more than she earned in 3 months. Who? Who would do such a thing? Mr. Schultz shrugged. A mountain man, by the look of him. Big fellow, long, dark hair, buckskins. He did not give his name, just said to tell you it was paid for. The man from the stairs, the man who had carried her laundry. Molly sank down onto her narrow bed, staring at the crates of bread and feeling emotions she could not name swelling in her chest. Why would a stranger, a man she had never seen before today, spend such a sum on her behalf? It made no sense, and yet the evidence was all around her, the smell of fresh bread filling her small room, making her mouth water and her stomach clench with desperate hunger. Miss? Mr. Schultz's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you all right? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Please thank the young men for carrying everything up. After they left, Molly sat alone in her room, surrounded by more food than she had seen in months. Slowly, almost reverently, she reached for a loaf of bread and tore off a piece. The crust crackled under her fingers, and the soft white interior practically melted on her tongue. She closed her eyes and chewed slowly, savoring every bite, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. She ate until her stomach felt full for the first time in months, and then she carefully wrapped the remaining bread to keep it fresh. But even as she organized the unexpected bounty, her mind kept returning to the mysterious mountain man who had done this for her. She did not even know his name. The next morning, Molly woke with a sense of purpose. She could not accept such generosity without at least attempting to thank the man properly. After helping Mrs. Chen with the early morning washing, she ventured out into the town, asking discreet questions about the tall mountain man with the long, dark hair. It did not take long to get answers. In a town the size of Bitterroot, a man like Nathaniel Crane was memorable. She learned that he was staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street, that he came to town twice a year to sell his furs, and that he kept to himself and rarely spoke to anyone beyond conducting his business. Armed with this information, Molly baked. She took some of the flour she had been saving and combined it with butter and sugar she borrowed from Mrs. Chen, and she made a dozen sugar cookies. They were simple, nothing fancy, but she shaped them carefully and baked them until they were golden brown. When they had cooled, she wrapped them in a clean cloth and made her way to the boarding house. The landlady, Mrs. Morrison, was a round, cheerful woman who ran the establishment with brisk efficiency. "You are looking for Mr. Crane?" she asked, eyeing Molly with undisguised curiosity. "He is in room 7, but I must warn you, he is not much for conversation. Keeps to himself, that one." "I just want to thank him for a kindness," Molly said, clutching her package of cookies. "It will only take a moment." Mrs. Morrison nodded and gestured toward the stairs. "Second floor, end of the hall. But do not say I did not warn you." Molly climbed the stairs on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. She had spent the morning working up her courage, but now that she was actually here, she felt absurdly nervous. What would she say to him? How did one thank a stranger for buying an entire bakery on her behalf? She knocked on the door of room 7 before she could lose her nerve. There was a long pause, and then the door opened to reveal Nathaniel Crane filling the doorway. He had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the frame, and up close, Molly was struck again by his sheer size. But his eyes were kind, and when he saw her standing in the hallway, something that might have been pleasure flickered across his weathered face. "Miss," he said, his deep voice sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. I wanted to thank you." She held out the package of cookies, suddenly feeling foolish. What were a dozen cookies compared to $15 worth of bread? "I made these for you. It is a small thing, but I wanted you to know how much your kindness meant to me." Nathaniel took the package carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. He unwrapped the cloth and looked at the cookies, and then he did something Molly had not expected. He smiled. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, almost boyish despite his obvious maturity. "You did not need to do this," he said, "but I thank you." "I did need to," Molly insisted. "What you did buying all that bread, it was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. I do not even know your name." "Nathaniel Crane. Most people call me Nate." "I am Molly Hayes, and I truly do not know how to thank you properly, Mr. Crane. That was so much money, and you do not even know me." He leaned against the doorframe, studying her with those dark, steady eyes. "Did not sit right, seeing you turned away hungry. Had the money. You needed the food. Simple as that." "But $15. "Just money," he interrupted gently. "Mountains are full of beaver and mink. I will trap more come winter. But you needed to eat now." Molly felt tears prickling at her eyes again. She had grown so accustomed to hardship, to being dismissed and overlooked, that simple kindness felt almost overwhelming. "You are a good man, Mr. Crane." "Just Nate," he said, "and I'm not good or bad. I'm just a man who saw someone who needed help." They stood in the hallway for a moment, neither quite sure what to say next. Finally, Nate cleared his throat. "Would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" "Nothing fancy, just the dining room downstairs. Mrs. Morrison is a fair cook." Molly's heart fluttered in her chest. Was he asking to court her? Or was this simply a continuation of his kindness to someone he perceived as needy? Either way, she found herself wanting to accept. "I would like that very much." 6 o'clock then. I will meet you in the front parlor." As Molly walked back to her room above the laundry, she felt as if she were floating. It was absurd. Really, she barely knew the man, and one dinner did not mean anything significant. But she could not remember the last time someone had looked at her the way Nate had, as if she were worth seeing, worth knowing. She spent the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation, pressing her best dress and washing her hair, trying to make herself presentable. Her best dress was not much better than her everyday calico, but it was a soft green color that brought out her eyes, and she had embroidered small flowers along the collar during the long winter evenings when she had nothing else to occupy her hands. At precisely 6 o'clock, she descended the stairs of the boarding house and found Nate waiting for her in the parlor. He had changed into a clean shirt, and his long hair was neatly combed back, though he had not cut it. He looked imposing and wild and somehow perfect, and when he saw her, that smile crossed his face again. "You look nice," he said simply. "Thank you. So do you." Mrs. Morrison had set up a small table in the corner of the dining room, away from the other boarders, and she served them roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, followed by apple pie for dessert. It was the finest meal Molly had eaten in months, perhaps years, and she had to force herself not to eat too quickly, to maintain some semblance of ladylike behavior. Nate was not a big talker, but Molly found his silence comfortable rather than awkward. When he did speak, his words were thoughtful and sincere. He told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands, about the rhythms of the seasons and the satisfaction of living close to the land. "It is lonely sometimes," he admitted, "but it is honest. No pretending, no putting on airs, just you and the mountain and whatever you can make of it." "It sounds wonderful," Molly said wistfully. "I have lived in town all my life. I cannot imagine what it would be like to have that much space, that much quiet." "You would like it, I think," Nate said, studying her face. "You have that look about you. Like you are tired of being crowded." It was an astute observation, and Molly was surprised by his perceptiveness. I suppose I am. There's not much space in my life right now, not much room to breathe. Tell me about yourself, Nate said. How did you end up working at the laundry? Molly hesitated, not wanting to burden him with her troubles, but there was something about his steady gaze that invited honesty. My father died 6 months ago. He was a carpenter, a good one, but he liked to gamble. When he died, I discovered that he had debts I knew nothing about. The creditors took everything: our house, our furniture, even my mother's silver spoons that I had hoped to keep. I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back. No other family. None. My mother died when I was 10, and I was an only child. I found work at the laundry, which came with a room, and I have been doing whatever I can to survive since then, mending, washing, sometimes helping at the hotel when they need extra hands. It is not much, but it is better than the alternatives. Nate's jaw tightened with anger on her behalf. You should not have to struggle like that. You are a good woman, hard-working. You deserve better. Deserve and get are two different things, Molly said with a sad smile, but I'm grateful for what I have. At least I have a roof over my head and honest work. Many women in my position would not even have that much. They talked until the dining room began to empty and Mrs. Morrison started giving them meaningful looks. Finally, Nate walked Molly to the front door of the boarding house, and they stood together on the porch, neither wanting the evening to end. I leave in 3 days, Nate said abruptly, back to the mountains, but I would like to see you again before I go, if you are willing. I would like that very much, Molly said softly. Tomorrow, then? I could call for you in the afternoon. Maybe we could take a walk. That sounds lovely. Nate reached out and took her hand, his rough, calloused palm engulfing her smaller, softer one. He held it for just a moment, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles, and then he released her. Good night, Molly Hayes. Good night, Nate Crane. Molly walked back to her room in a daze, her hand tingling where he had touched her. It was foolish to develop feelings for a man who would be leaving in 3 days, returning to a life in the mountains where she could not follow. But her heart did not seem to care about logic or practicality. Her heart only knew that Nathaniel Crane made her feel safe and valued in a way she had never experienced before. The next afternoon, Nate arrived at the laundry wearing the same buckskin pants and cotton shirt, but he had a wildflower in his hand, a single purple columbine that he must have found growing somewhere outside of town. He offered it to Molly with an almost shy gesture that was endearing coming from such a large, imposing man. For you, he said. Thought you might like it. Molly took the flower carefully, holding it as if it were made of spun glass. It is beautiful. Thank you. They walked together through the streets of Bitterroot and then out beyond the town limits, following a path that led along the creek. The afternoon was warm and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Nate walked slowly to match her pace, and they talked about everything and nothing, her childhood memories of helping her father in his workshop, his stories of learning to trap from an old French-Canadian who had taught him the ways of the wilderness. Do you ever want to come back to town? Molly asked. To live among people again? Nate was quiet for a moment, considering. I used to think I never would, but lately. He trailed off, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Lately, I've been wondering if maybe I've been missing something up there. If maybe solitude is not the same as contentment. What changed your mind? You did, he said simply. Seeing you standing outside that bakery, hungry but too proud to beg. Watching you carry that heavy basket up those stairs, even though you could barely lift it. Talking with you last night and realizing that maybe I have been alone for so long that I forgot what it feels like to want to share my life with someone. Molly stopped walking, turning to face him. Nate, you barely know me. How can you say such things? I know enough, he said, reaching out to gently cup her cheek with his large hand. I know you are brave and strong and kind. I know you face hardship without complaint. I know that when I look at you, I feel something I have not felt in all my years in the mountains. And I know that in 3 days I will have to ride away from here, and the thought of leaving you behind makes my chest hurt in a way that has nothing to do with altitude. Tears spilled down Molly's cheeks, and she leaned into his touch. I feel it too. I do not understand it, but I feel it. And I do not want you to leave. Then come with me, Nate said, the words tumbling out before he could question them. "Come back to the mountains with me. I have a good cabin, solid and warm. There is plenty of game and a garden plot. It is hard work, but it is honest work, and you would never be hungry again. You would never have to wash other people's laundry or mend their clothes for pennies. You would be He paused, searching for the right words. You would be mine, and I would take care of you for the rest of my life." Molly stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was madness. They had known each other for barely 2 days. She could not possibly pick up her life and follow a virtual stranger into the wilderness. It defied all reason, all propriety, all common sense. And yet, what life was she leaving behind? A tiny room above a laundry. Backbreaking work that left her exhausted and barely able to feed herself. No family, no prospects, no hope of anything better. What did she have to lose except loneliness and poverty? "Are you asking me to marry you?" she whispered. "Yes," Nate said without hesitation. "I'm asking you to be my wife. I know it is sudden, and I know I am not much of a catch, just a mountain man who spends most of his time alone with the beavers and the pine trees. But I can promise you that I will work hard to provide for you, and I will protect you with my life, and I will do everything in my power to make you happy. If you will have me." Molly looked into his dark eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and hope. This was not a man who made promises lightly. This was a man who meant every word he said. And suddenly, the decision became simple. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will marry you." Nate let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and then he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his broad chest as if she were something infinitely precious. Molly melted into his embrace, feeling his strength surrounding her, his heartbeat steady and strong against her ear. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt safe. She felt cherished. She felt home. They were married 2 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. The preacher, Reverend Williams, was bemused but willing to perform the ceremony on such short notice, especially when Nate paid him generously for his services. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Morrison stood as witnesses, both of them eyeing the unlikely couple with a mixture of curiosity and approval. Molly wore her green dress with the embroidered flowers, and Nate wore his cleanest shirt and had even trimmed his beard slightly, though his hair still fell past his shoulders in dark waves. When they exchanged their vows, his voice was strong and sure, and hers was soft but steady. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Nate kissed her gently, almost reverently, his large hands cradling her face as if she were made of porcelain. After the ceremony, they had a simple meal at the boarding house, and then they retired to Nate's room to prepare for the journey. Molly had few possessions to pack: a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, the few personal items she had managed to save from her father's creditors. Everything fit into a small canvas bag that Nate tied to his horse with practiced efficiency. "We will travel for about 4 days, he explained as he checked the supplies. "The trail is rough in places, but I have a good horse, and we will take our time. We will camp along the way, and I will teach you how to read the land, how to find water, how to build a fire, everything you will need to know to be a mountain woman." "I am sure I will be terrible at it," Molly said with a nervous laugh. "I have never been camping in my life." "You will learn," Nate said confidently. "You are stronger than you think, Molly Crane." Molly Crane, her new name. She tested it out silently, feeling how it fit, and decided she liked it. It sounded sturdy and real, like something that could weather storms and endure hardships. They left Bitterroot early the next morning, before the town had fully awakened. Nate rode his large bay gelding, with Molly seated in front of him, cradled against his chest. He had one arm around her waist, holding her securely, while the other hand managed the reins with easy competence. The horse was well trained and responded to the slightest pressure, carrying them steadily northward into the mountains. As they left the town behind, and the trail began to climb into the foothills, Molly felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was leaving behind everything familiar, venturing into unknown territory with a man she barely knew. But she was also leaving behind poverty and struggle, loneliness and despair. Whatever awaited her in the mountains, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The first day of travel was long and tiring. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, crossing streams and skirting rock faces. Nate was a patient teacher, pointing out landmarks and explaining the geography. He showed her how to identify different types of trees, how to spot game trails, how to read the sky for weather signs. "That ridge there," he said, pointing to a distinctive formation of rock, "that is how I know we are on the right path. And see how those clouds are building in the west? That means rain by evening. We will need to make camp soon, find good shelter." True to his prediction, the rain began just as they were setting up camp in a small clearing protected by an overhang of rock. Nate worked quickly, building a fire and stringing up a canvas tarp to keep them dry. He showed Molly how to arrange their bedrolls and supplies to maximize the limited dry space and how to keep the fire burning despite the damp air. They ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, washed down with water from a nearby stream. It was not fancy, but Molly found she did not mind. There was something satisfying about the simple necessity of it, about knowing that they were taking care of their basic needs through their own effort and skill. As darkness fell and the rain drummed steadily on the canvas above them, Nate added more wood to the fire and spread out their bedrolls side by side. Molly felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. They were married now, and she knew what that meant, knew what was expected. But she was innocent and uncertain, and she did not know how to begin. Nate seemed to sense her anxiety. He settled down on his bedroll and held out his hand to her. "Come here," he said gently. "We do not have to do anything tonight. I know this is all new and strange for you. We can just sleep." Molly took his hand and let him pull her down beside him. "But we are married," she said softly. "I am your wife now. And you will be my wife tomorrow and the day after that and for the rest of our lives," Nate said, wrapping his arms around her and tucking her against his chest. "There is no rush, Molly. I want you to feel safe and comfortable. When the time is right, we will both know." She relaxed against him, feeling the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. His arms were strong and protective around her, and the sound of the rain and the crackling fire were oddly soothing. Despite the hard ground and the unfamiliar surroundings, she found herself drifting off to sleep, feeling more secure than she had in months. Over the next 3 days, they fell into an easy rhythm. Nate proved to be everything he had promised: patient, protective, and constantly attentive to her needs. He made sure she was warm and dry, that she had enough to eat, that the pace of travel was not too demanding. He taught her the skills she would need, not with condescension, but with genuine enthusiasm for sharing his knowledge. Molly proved to be an apt student. She learned to identify edible plants, to start a fire with flint and steel, to read the subtle signs of wildlife. She learned to move quietly through the forest, to step carefully on the rocky trails, to anticipate the horse's movements and adjust her weight accordingly. With each new skill, she felt a growing sense of confidence and competence. But more than the practical skills, she learned about her husband. She learned that despite his size and strength, he was gentle and considerate. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, and that he loved the mountains with a passion that bordered on reverence. She learned that he was a man of few words but deep feelings, and that when he said something, he meant it absolutely. On the 4th day, as they crested a final ridge, Nate pointed to a valley below them. "There," he said with unmistakable pride in his voice, "that is home." Molly looked down and saw a small cabin nestled in a clearing beside a stream. It was built of logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch across the front. Behind it, she could see a small outbuilding that was probably a stable, and beyond that, the forest rose up the mountainside in waves of green. The valley was beautiful, almost achingly so, with wildflowers dotting the meadow and the stream sparkling in the afternoon sun. "It is perfect," she breathed. Nate smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Come on, let me show you your new home." They rode down into the valley, and as they approached the cabin, Molly could see the care that Nate had put into building it. The logs were neatly fitted, the roof was solid, and the porch was wide and welcoming. He helped her down from the horse and then pushed open the door, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was simple but comfortable. There was a large stone fireplace on one wall, a sturdy table and chairs in the center of the room, and a big bed in one corner covered with fur blankets. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies and cooking equipment, and there were pegs for hanging clothes and gear. Everything was clean and well organized, speaking of a man who took pride in his space. "It is not fancy," Nate said, watching her reaction carefully, "but it is solid and warm. I built it myself, every log and beam. I can add on to it if you want, maybe another room or a bigger kitchen area." Molly turned to him, her eyes shining. "It is wonderful, Nate. It is more than I ever dreamed of having." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Then I'm glad. I want you to be happy here, Molly. I want this to feel like home." "It already does," she whispered against his chest. And she meant it. Despite the strangeness of everything, despite how different this was from the life she had known in town, she felt a sense of rightness here. This cabin, this valley, this man, they all felt like the home she had been searching for without even knowing it. That evening, Nate prepared a feast to celebrate their arrival. He had venison stored in the small root cellar beside the cabin, and he roasted it over the fire, along with wild onions and potatoes he had grown in his garden. They ate until they were pleasantly full, and then they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I have lived alone here for 5 years," Nate said quietly. "Built the cabin, learned the land, made it my home. But it always felt like something was missing. I told myself I was content with solitude, that I did not need anything more than the mountains and my work. But I was lying to myself." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You are what was missing, Molly. You make this place complete." Molly felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I do not know how I got so lucky. A week ago I could not afford bread. Now I have a husband who bought me an entire bakery, a beautiful home, and a future I never dared to imagine." "The luck is mine," Nate said firmly. "You could have said no. You could have been sensible and stayed in town, found some shopkeeper or clerk to marry. But you took a chance on a mountain man who did not have much to offer except hard work and a lonely cabin. That takes courage, Molly. That takes faith. And I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life proving that your faith was not misplaced." He leaned in and kissed her, and this time there was heat behind the gentleness, a promise of passion held carefully in check. Molly responded instinctively, her arms sliding up around his neck, her body pressing closer to his. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "Come to bed," Nate said, his voice rough. "Let me show you how much I love you." They moved inside, and Nate closed the door behind them, shutting out the world. He undressed her slowly, his hands gentle but sure, and she stood trembling under his touch, feeling both nervous and eager. When she was bare before him, he took a moment to simply look at her, his gaze traveling over her soft curves with unmistakable appreciation. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice full of wonder, "every inch of you." Molly had always been self-conscious about her body, aware that she was rounder and softer than the fashionable ideal. But under Nate's admiring gaze, she felt beautiful for the first time in her life. His appreciation was genuine and unfeigned, and it gave her the courage to reach out and begin unbuttoning his shirt. He helped her undress him, and then they were both bare in the firelight. Nate's body was even more impressive without clothes, all hard muscle and bronzed skin, with scars here and there that spoke of a life lived close to danger. He lifted her easily and carried her to the bed, laying her down on the soft furs with exquisite care. What followed was tender and passionate, awkward at times, but always loving. Nate was patient with her inexperience, guiding her gently, showing her how their bodies could fit together in pleasure. And Molly, who had never known physical affection beyond a brief kiss, discovered that she was capable of passion, that her body could respond with eager intensity to her husband's touch. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the furs, both of them slightly stunned by the intensity of what they had shared. Nate stroked her hair gently, pressing kisses to her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I am more than all right," Molly said, her voice dreamy with contentment. "I am happy, Nate, truly happy." "Good," he said, pulling her closer. "That is all I want, your happiness." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Molly dreamed of the future of years spent in this valley, of children playing in the meadow, of growing old beside the man who had bought her a bakery and given her a home. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Molly learned the rhythms of life in the mountains, so different from the structured days in town. Here, time was marked by the sun and the seasons, not by clock hands and schedules. She woke with the dawn, and went to bed with the dark, her days filled with the constant work of survival. Nate taught her to fish in the stream, baiting hooks and reading the water for the best spots. She caught her first trout on a bright morning in late July, laughing with delight as the fish fought on the line. Nate showed her how to clean it properly, and they fried it for lunch, the flesh sweet and flaky. She learned to tend the garden, pulling weeds and watering the vegetables that would see them through the winter. Nate had planted beans and squash, carrots and turnips, even a few precious tomato plants that required careful attention. Molly found she enjoyed the work, the feeling of dirt under her fingernails and the satisfaction of watching things grow. She learned to shoot, though she was not particularly good at it. Nate was endlessly patient, teaching her to hold the rifle steady, to breathe and squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. She missed more often than she hit, but she kept practicing, knowing that in the mountains the ability to hunt could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. But beyond the practical skills, Molly was learning about herself. She discovered that she was stronger than she had believed, capable of doing hard physical labor without collapsing. She discovered that she loved the solitude of the mountains, the way the silence wrapped around her like a blanket. She discovered that she had married not just a good man, but the right man, someone whose quiet strength complemented her own gentle nature. And Nate, for his part, was discovering the joys of partnership. After years of solitude, he found he loved having someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone to share his observations and plans. He loved the way Molly listened to him, really listened, asking thoughtful questions and offering her own insights. He loved the way she made the cabin feel like a home, adding small touches, wildflowers in a jar on the table, a quilt she was piecing together from scraps, her laugh echoing off the walls. Most of all, he loved having her in his bed each night, her soft body curved against his, her breathing slow and steady in sleep. He had not realized how lonely he had been until he was no longer alone, and now he could not imagine going back to that solitary existence. August melted into September, and the aspens began to turn gold on the mountainsides. The air grew crisp at night, and Nate began preparing for winter in earnest. He spent long days cutting and stacking firewood, chopping until his arms ached and sweat poured down his back despite the cool air. Molly helped, carrying the split logs and stacking them neatly under the overhang of the porch, where they would stay dry. "We will need at least 10 cords to make it through the winter," Nate explained, pausing to wipe his forehead. "Maybe more. The cold here can be brutal, and we will be burning wood day and night from November through March." "Then we will cut 10 cords," Molly said firmly. "Or however much we need. We will do it together." Nate looked at her, this woman who had once been too poor to buy bread, now hefting logs and stacking firewood without complaint. Pride swelled in his chest. "You are remarkable, you know that?" Molly laughed. "I'm just doing what needs to be done, same as you." "No," Nate said seriously. "You're doing more than that. You are thriving. You have taken to this life like you were born to it." It was true. Molly had never been happier. The hard work was satisfying in a way that washing other people's laundry had never been. Here, every task had visible results, wood stacked, food preserved, the garden yielding its bounty. She could see the direct impact of her labor, and it gave her a sense of purpose and pride. In late September, Nate took her on her first hunting trip. They hiked up into the higher elevations, following game trails and looking for sign. Nate moved through the forest like a ghost, absolutely silent, and he taught Molly to do the same, where to place her feet, how to control her breathing, how to blend into the landscape. They spotted a small herd of elk in a meadow just before sunset, the big animals grazing peacefully in the golden light. Nate took careful aim and brought down a young bull with a single shot. Then he showed Molly how to field dress the animal, a messy but necessary task. She was squeamish at first, but she pushed through it, knowing that this meat would feed them for months. They packed the elk out over 2 trips, carrying the heavy quarters back to the cabin on their backs. It was exhausting work, but when they finally had all the meat safely stored in the root cellar, Molly felt a tremendous sense of accomplishment. They had killed and processed their own food. They were truly self-sufficient. October brought the first snow, just a dusting that melted by noon but served as a warning of what was to come. Nate spent every available hour checking and rechecking their supplies, making sure they had everything they would need to survive the long winter. "You are worrying," Molly observed one evening as she watched him pace the cabin, mentally tallying their stores. "I have always worried before winter," Nate admitted. "But this year it is different. This year I have you to think about. If something happens to me, if I get hurt or sick, you would be alone up here. That scares me more than anything." Molly stood and went to him, taking his face in her hands. "Nothing is going to happen to you. We are going to survive this winter together, and the next one, and the one after that. We are strong, Nate, both of us." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I do not say it enough, but I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," Molly whispered, "with everything I am." The heavy snows came in November, blanketing the valley in white and effectively isolating them from the outside world. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, the air so cold that it hurt to breathe. But inside the cabin, they were warm and secure. They fell into a comfortable routine during the long winter months. Nate tended to the horses in the stable, making sure they had food and water and were protected from the worst of the cold. He also checked his trap lines every few days, bringing back beaver and mink pelts that he would sell in the spring. Molly took charge of the household tasks, cooking, mending, keeping the fire going. She discovered she had a talent for making something out of nothing, creating hearty stews from dried meat and root vegetables, baking bread in the Dutch oven, even improvising desserts from their limited supplies. The long evenings were spent together by the fire. Nate carved beautiful, intricate work that transformed simple pieces of wood into animals and figures. Molly sewed, working on the quilt and mending their clothes. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories from their pasts. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, comfortable in each other's presence. And at night, they explored each other with increasing confidence and passion. Molly had overcome her initial shyness, and she had learned what pleased her husband, just as he had learned her body's responses and preferences. Their lovemaking was tender and fierce by turns, a physical expression of the deepening emotional bond between them. It was during one of those quiet winter evenings in January that Molly realized she had not had her monthly courses since before they were married. At first, she attributed it to the change in her diet and the physical demands of mountain life. But as the weeks passed and her breasts grew tender and her stomach began to feel unsettled in the mornings, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. Joy, certainly she and Nate had talked about having children, and she knew he wanted a family. But also fear. She was isolated in the mountains, far from any doctor or midwife. What if something went wrong? What if she could not safely deliver the baby? She knew she had to tell Nate, but she waited until she was certain, until she had missed her courses for a third month and her belly was beginning to show a slight rounding. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire, she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "Nate," she said softly, "I'm going to have a baby. Your baby." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face split into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that startled her. He scooped her up carefully and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. "A baby," he said, setting her down gently and placing both hands on her stomach, as if he could already feel the child growing there. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Molly asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Nate said, pulling her into a careful embrace. "I am. I do not even have words, Molly. A family. I'm going to have a family." But then his expression turned serious, and she could see the worry creeping in. "When? When will the baby come?" "Late summer, I think. August or early September." Nate nodded, his mind already racing through the implications. "We will need to go to town before the birth. Find a midwife or a doctor, someone who can help when the time comes. I cannot take any chances with your safety or the baby's." "But the journey," Molly said. "It is 4 days to Bitterroot, and the trail can be difficult. What if something happens along the way?" "We will wait until the snow clears and the trail is safe," Nate said firmly. "Maybe early June. That will give us time to get there and settled before the baby comes. And maybe—" He paused, considering. "Maybe we should think about spending more time in town. at least during the summers. It would be good for a child to have playmates, to go to school. Molly was surprised by the offer. She knew how much Nate valued his solitude, how uncomfortable he was with the social demands of town life. You would do that? Leave the mountains? Not permanently, Nate said. This is still home. But maybe we could find a balance. Winters here, summers in town, the best of both worlds. Molly leaned against him, feeling tears of gratitude and love slide down her cheeks. You are a good man, Nathaniel Crane. The best man I have ever known. The rest of the winter passed slowly, each day bringing them closer to spring. Nate was even more attentive than usual, constantly making sure Molly was comfortable and not overexerting herself. She found his protectiveness both touching and occasionally frustrating. She was pregnant, not fragile, and she insisted on continuing to do her share of the work. When the snows finally began to melt in late March, revealing the brown earth and the first green shoots of new growth, they both felt a sense of relief. They had survived their first winter together, and they were about to embark on a new chapter of their lives. In early June, as planned, they packed up supplies and began the journey back to Bitterroot. Molly was 5 months pregnant now, her belly round and unmistakable. The journey was more difficult this time, with frequent stops to rest and careful attention to Molly's comfort. But they made it safely, arriving in town on a warm afternoon. Bitterroot had not changed much in the months since they had left. The same buildings lined the main street, the same people went about their business. But Molly saw it all through different eyes now. She was no longer the desperate, hungry woman who had stood outside the bakery window. She was Mrs. Nathaniel Crane, respected and provided for, with a child on the way and a future full of promise. They took a room at Mrs. Morrison's boarding house, and the landlady welcomed them warmly, clearly delighted to see them again. News of Molly's pregnancy spread quickly, and before long, several of the town's women had come to call, offering advice and assistance. Dr. Foster, the town physician, examined Molly and pronounced her healthy and the baby developing normally. Come see me once a week until the birth, he instructed, and if anything seems wrong, bleeding, severe pain, anything at all, you come immediately, day or night. Nate found work helping to build a new stable at the edge of town, his strength and carpentry skills making him valuable. The money he earned, combined with the proceeds from selling his winter's catch of furs, gave them a comfortable cushion of savings. He even began to talk about buying a small house in town, something they could use during their summer visits. We could fix it up over the years, he said one evening as they sat on Mrs. Morrison's porch, watching the sunset. Make it a real home. The cabin will always be where we spend our winters, but maybe having a place here would be good for the children. Children, plural, Molly teased. Well, we are not going to stop at one, are we? Nate said with a grin. I'm hoping for at least 3 or 4, a whole cabin full of little ones. Molly laughed, placing her hand on her swollen belly. Let us get through this one first, and then we can talk about more. The baby came on a hot August afternoon, earlier than expected, but not dangerously so. Molly's labor started in the morning with mild cramping that gradually intensified. By noon, she was in full labor, with Mrs. Morrison and 2 other experienced mothers attending her while Nate paced anxiously downstairs. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the evening. Molly had never experienced such pain, such intensity of sensation. But through it all, she held on to the knowledge that Nate was nearby, that she was safe and cared for, and that at the end of this ordeal, she would hold her child in her arms. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky orange and pink, the baby was born. A boy, healthy and strong, with a lusty cry that could be heard throughout the boarding house. Dr. Foster cut the cord and cleaned the infant, then placed him in Molly's arms. You have a son, Mrs. Crane, he said with a smile. A fine, healthy boy. Molly looked down at the tiny face, the dark eyes that were trying to focus on her, the small mouth that was already rooting for food. Love washed over her in a wave so powerful it took her breath away. This was her son, hers and Nate's, a miracle they had created together. Nate was allowed into the room a few minutes later, and the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Molly, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket, his son, his family. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and knelt beside the bed. "Is he all right? Are you all right?" "We are both fine," Molly said, her voice weak but happy. "Come meet your son." Nate reached out with one large calloused finger and touched the baby's cheek with exquisite gentleness. The infant turned toward the touch, and Nate felt his heart crack open with a love he had never imagined possible. "What should we name him?" Molly asked. Nate thought for a moment. "What about James, after your father?" Molly's eyes filled with tears. Despite everything, despite her father's flaws and the hardship his debts had caused her, she had loved him. "James Nathaniel Crane," she said softly. "I think that is perfect." They spent the next few weeks in Bitterroot, giving Molly time to recover and the baby time to grow stronger. Nate was an attentive father, constantly holding his son, marveling at every tiny movement and sound. He changed diapers with the same competence he brought to everything else, and he walked the floor for hours when the baby was fussy, his deep voice rumbling lullabies he made up as he went. In early September, when the aspens were just beginning to turn gold, they made the journey back to the mountains. This time, Molly rode the horse while Nate walked beside her, carrying the baby in a cradleboard strapped to his back. It was slow going, but they took their time, stopping frequently to rest and feed the baby. When they finally crested the ridge and looked down into their valley, Molly felt a surge of joy. This was home. This beautiful, isolated place was where they would raise their son, where they would build their life together. That winter was different from the previous one. The cabin that had seemed spacious with just the two of them now felt crowded with the baby's cradle and supplies. Sleep was scarce, with James waking every few hours to eat. The work of survival was complicated by the constant demands of a newborn. But despite the exhaustion and the challenges, Molly and Nate were happy. They worked together seamlessly, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating the small victories. James's first smile, his first laugh, the way he tracked movement with his eyes and reached for the bright objects they dangled before him, every milestone was a source of wonder and delight. As James grew from infant to toddler, the cabin rang with the sounds of childhood. He was a sturdy boy, taking after his father in build, with his mother's soft features and kind eyes. He learned to walk on the wooden floor of the cabin, pulling himself up on the furniture and taking wobbly steps between his parents' outstretched arms. True to their plan, they spent winters in the mountains and summers in town. Nate had purchased a small house on the edge of Bitterroot, a modest two-bedroom structure that he gradually improved over the years. James had playmates there, other children his age, and when he was old enough he attended the town school, learning to read and write and cipher. But the mountains remained the heart of their life. In the mountains, James learned to fish and hunt, to read tracks and identify plants. He learned the value of hard work and self-sufficiency, and he grew strong and capable under his father's patient tutelage. When James was 3, Molly became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. The baby, a girl they named Sarah, was born in town on a cool May morning. She was a delicate child, all rosy cheeks and golden curls, and she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she first opened her eyes. 2 years after Sarah came another boy, whom they named Thomas, and 3 years after that, their final child, another girl they named Elizabeth. The cabin had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Nate adding a second story that provided bedrooms for the children. The years passed in a blur of activity and love. Nate and Molly watched their children grow, each one developing their own personality and interests. James was serious and responsible, a natural leader. Sarah was gentle and artistic, always drawing or singing. Thomas was adventurous and bold, constantly pushing boundaries and testing limits. Elizabeth was the baby, sweet and funny, with a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. Through it all, Nate and Molly's love deepened and matured. They had built not just a life, but a legacy, a family that was strong and secure, rooted in hard work and mutual respect. The desperate woman who had once stood outside a bakery window, unable to afford bread, was now a confident mother and partner, essential to the functioning of their mountain homestead. And the solitary mountain man who had bought an entire bakery for a stranger had found something more valuable than all the furs he could trap a family to love, a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to wake up each morning with gratitude and joy. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Nate and Molly stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset over the mountains. The children were inside, arguing cheerfully over a game, their voices drifting out through the open door. Nate put his arm around Molly's shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of long familiarity. "Do you ever regret it?" Nate asked. "Leaving town, coming to the mountains with me?" Molly looked up at him, her face lined now with age and experience, her body softer and rounder after 4 children, but her eyes still bright with love. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything, Nate. A home, a family, a life worth living. How could I regret that?" "You gave me just as much," Nate said, pulling her closer. "More even. You took a lonely mountain man and taught him what it means to have a family. You made this cabin a home. You gave me children to carry on after I am gone. Everything good in my life started the day I saw you standing outside that bakery." "The day you bought me an entire bakery," Molly said with a laugh. "I still cannot believe you did that. $15 for a woman you did not even know." "Best money I ever spent," Nate said firmly. "Best decision I ever made, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." They stood together in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of their children and the whisper of wind through the pines. The journey that had started with 3 pennies and an empty stomach had led to this, a full life, a loving family, a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Molly thought about the long road that had brought her here. The poverty and hunger, the fear and uncertainty, the desperate loneliness of those days in Bitterroot seemed like another lifetime now. She had been transformed by love and hard work, by the mountains and the man who had chosen her. And Nate, holding his wife close as the cool evening air wrapped around them, felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. He had everything he had never dared to hope for, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was the luckiest man alive. The children eventually called them inside for dinner, and they went willingly, ready to sit around the table they had built together, to share a meal with the family they had created, to continue building the life that had started with a simple act of kindness outside a bakery in Montana Territory. As James grew into a young man, he proved to have inherited his father's skill with trapping and hunting, but also his mother's gentle heart. He was courting a young woman from town, the daughter of the mercantile owner, and Nate and Molly suspected they would have a wedding to plan within the year. Sarah had discovered a talent for teaching and had taken a position at the Bitterroot school, beloved by her students for her patience and creativity. Thomas, now 16, was still wild and adventurous, talking about joining a cattle drive or heading to the gold fields, though Nate suspected he would eventually settle down closer to home. And Elizabeth, at 12, was the heart of the family, keeping everyone connected with her irrepressible energy and affection. The house in Bitterroot had become a gathering place for the family, with children and eventually grandchildren filling its rooms during the summer months. But the cabin in the mountains remained sacred, the place where Nate and Molly could retreat to find peace and remember their roots. Years continued to pass, marked by births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, the ordinary moments that make up a life. Nate's hair turned silver, and his body, though still strong, began to show the wear of decades of hard labor. Molly's face became lined with laugh lines and crow's feet, her hands gnarled from years of work, but she remained beautiful in Nate's eyes. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by their children and a growing brood of grandchildren. James and his wife had given them 2 grandsons and a granddaughter. Sarah had married a teacher from back east, and they had a son on the way. Even Thomas had finally settled down, marrying a rancher's daughter and starting to build a life in the valley adjacent to Nate and Molly's. As Nate stood at the head of the table that anniversary evening, looking at the faces of his family, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. 30 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I was a lonely man living alone in these mountains. I thought that was all life had to offer me. Then I saw a woman standing outside a bakery, too proud to beg but too hungry to walk away, and something in me knew that my life was about to change. He turned to Molly, taking her hand. You have given me 30 years of joy, of purpose, of love. You have given me children and grandchildren, a legacy I am proud of. Every day with you has been a gift, and I thank God for the impulse that made me walk into that bakery and buy you bread." Molly was crying now, tears streaming down her lined face. "And you gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a home when I was homeless, food when I was hungry, love when I felt unlovable. You saw value in me when I could barely see it in myself. I love you, Nathaniel Crane, more today than I did 30 years ago, and that is saying something." The family applauded and cheered, and the celebration continued late into the night with music and dancing and stories. But eventually, everyone retired to their beds, and Nate and Molly were left alone on the porch once more, their favorite place to talk and reflect. "Do you think we have done right by them?" Molly asked, gesturing toward the cabin where their children and grandchildren slept. "Have we given them what they need to make good lives? We have taught them to work hard, to love deeply, and to value family above all else," Nate said. "That is the best anyone can do. The rest is up to them." "They are good people," Molly said softly. "All of them. We should be proud." "I am," Nate said. "So proud I could burst with it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and listening to the night sounds of the mountains. Finally, Nate spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know, when I bought that bakery for you, people in town thought I was crazy. Mrs. Morrison told me later that the whole town was talking about it, the strange mountain man who spent $15 on bread for a woman he did not know. Some people thought I was simple-minded. Others thought I had ulterior motives." "And what were your motives?" Molly asked with a smile, though she knew the answer. "I saw someone who needed help, and I had the means to help. It was that simple. I did not think about it deeply or plan it out. I just acted." He paused, then added, "But if I'm honest, there was something more. From the moment I saw you, standing there with such dignity despite your circumstances, I felt drawn to you. It was not just pity or kindness, it was recognition, like my soul knew yours, even though we had never met." "I felt it too," Molly confessed. "When you carried my laundry up those stairs, when you looked at me with those steady, kind eyes, something in me shifted. I knew you were different from any man I had ever met. I knew you were special." "Two lost souls finding each other in a Montana town," Nate mused. "What are the odds?" "God's hand," Molly said firmly. "It had to be. Nothing else makes sense. Out of all the times you could have come to town, all the places I could have been, we found each other at exactly the right moment. That is not luck or coincidence. That is divine providence." Nate nodded slowly. "I think you are right, and I am grateful for it every day." As they aged, Nate and Molly gradually transitioned more responsibility to their children. James took over much of the trapping operation, working the territory his father had established. Thomas managed the horses and livestock. Sarah organized the household during their summer stays in town. Elizabeth, even as she grew into a young woman herself, remained their helper and companion. On a crisp autumn morning in their 38th year of marriage, Nate and Molly made what would be their last trip together from town back to the mountain cabin. Nate was 70 now, his body finally showing the accumulated toll of a lifetime of hard labor. Molly was 65, still sturdy and capable, but slower than she used to be. The journey took longer than it once had, with frequent rest stops and careful navigation of the difficult sections of trail. But they made it safely, arriving at the cabin as the aspens blazed gold in the afternoon sun. That winter was peaceful and quiet. James checked on them regularly, bringing supplies and making sure they were well. But for the most part, Nate and Molly were alone together, just as they had been in their first winter as a married couple. They spent long hours by the fire, reminiscing about the years they had shared. Nate carved gifts for his grandchildren, animals and toys, and decorative pieces that each child would treasure. Molly worked on a memory quilt, incorporating fabric from significant moments in their life together. A piece of her green wedding dress, scraps from the children's baby clothes, squares of Nate's old shirts. "I want them to remember," she explained as she carefully stitched the pieces together. "I want our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know the story of how we started, how their grandfather bought a whole bakery for a poor maid and changed both of our lives forever." On a February evening, as snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Nate fell asleep in his chair and did not wake up. His passing was peaceful, a gentle transition from sleep to eternal rest. Molly sat with him for a long time, holding his hand, remembering the first time those strong, calloused fingers had held hers. The grief was profound, but it was not bitter. They had had 38 years together, had built a life and a family, had loved deeply and completely. She could not regret that, even as she mourned his loss. The family gathered for the funeral, held in the valley by the cabin Nate had built with his own hands. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the stream, with a simple stone marker bearing his name and the dates of his birth and death. But the real memorial was the legacy he left behind, the children and grandchildren who carried his values and his love forward into the next generation. Molly lived for another 7 years, dividing her time between the townhouse and extended visits with each of her children. She finished the memory quilt and gave it to James, trusting him to pass down the story to future generations. She held her great-grandchildren and told them about their great-grandfather, the mountain man who had bought a whole bakery for love. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, surrounded by family, she was laid to rest beside Nate on that hillside. Their stones stood side by side, two lives that had been separate becoming forever joined. Years turned into decades, and the cabin in the mountains passed down through the generations. It was maintained and treasured, expanded as needed, but always kept true to its original character. The story of Nate and Molly became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. The memory quilt hung in a place of honor in James's home, and then in his son's home, and then in his grandson's. Each generation learned the story of the poor maid who could not afford bread and the mountain man who bought an entire bakery to help her. They learned about the courage it took for Molly to leave everything she knew and follow Nate into the wilderness. They learned about the love that grew between two unlikely people and the family that was built on that foundation. The bakery in Bitterroot changed hands several times over the years, but the story persisted. Tourists visiting the town in later years would be told about the legendary romantic gesture, the mountain man who spent $15, an enormous sum in 1876, to buy every loaf and pastry for a woman he barely knew. The house in Bitterroot also remained in the family, renovated and updated, but kept as a connection to those early days. In the parlor hung a portrait that had been painted from memory by Sarah, showing Nate and Molly in their prime, him tall and strong with his long dark hair and muscled arms, her soft and pretty in her green dress, both of them smiling with the quiet contentment of people who have found their place in the world. The story of Nathaniel and Molly Crane became more than just family history. It became a reminder that sometimes the most significant moments in life come from simple acts of kindness, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that courage and faith can transform poverty and loneliness into abundance and connection. Their great-great-grandchildren, living in a world transformed by technology and progress that Nate and Molly could never have imagined, still made pilgrimages to that cabin in the mountains. They still stood by those graves on the hillside and felt connected to ancestors they had never met. They still told the story of how their family began, with 3 pennies and an empty stomach, a lonely mountain man with gold in his pockets, and a bakery full of bread that represented so much more than food. It represented hope and possibility and the transformative power of love. The creek still flowed beside the cabin, and wildflowers still bloomed in the meadow each summer. The mountains still stood eternal and unchanging, witness to the lives lived in their shadow. And the legacy of Nathaniel and Molly Crane continued, passed down through generations, a testament to the truth that the greatest wealth is not measured in gold or property, but in love shared, families built, and lives well lived. In the end, Nate's $15 had purchased more than bread. It had purchased a future not just for himself and Molly, but for all the generations that would follow. It had proven that sometimes the most impulsive, seemingly irrational decisions are actually the wisest ones we ever make. And it had shown that true love, the kind that lasts beyond death and echoes through generations, can begin in the most ordinary of moments: a hungry woman, a generous man, and a bakery window in a Montana town. The story lived on because it spoke to something universal in the human experience, the desire to be seen, to be valued, to find connection in a world that can feel cold and indifferent. Molly had been invisible, just another struggling person in a town full of them, until Nate chose to see her. And in seeing her, in recognizing her worth and her dignity, he had changed both of their lives immeasurably. As the years rolled on and the 20th century gave way to the 21st, as the world changed in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the mountain man and his bride, their story remained relevant. Because hunger and poverty still existed. Because loneliness and struggle were still part of the human condition. And because the antidote to those things, kindness, generosity, love, remained as powerful as ever. Every time a descendant told the story of the bakery, they were really telling a story about hope, about the possibility that no matter how dire your circumstances, no matter how impossible your situation seems, something can change. Someone can see you. Life can take an unexpected turn toward joy. And every time someone heard the story, they were reminded that they had the power to be that change for someone else, that they too could be the mountain man who walks into a bakery and purchases hope for a stranger. That small acts of kindness, impulsive gestures of generosity, could ripple forward through time in ways impossible to predict. The cabin still stood, solid and enduring, a physical reminder of what can be built when two people commit to building something together. The valley still bloomed with wildflowers each spring, nature's renewal mirroring the renewal that had taken place in two human hearts so long ago. And somewhere in the collective memory of a sprawling, far-flung family, Nathaniel Crane still walked the streets of Bitterroot, his shoulders broad and his heart generous, making the decision that would define his legacy. And Molly Hayes still stood outside that bakery window, her stomach empty but her spirit unbroken, waiting for the moment that would transform her life. They had been real people, with real struggles and real triumphs, who had lived and loved and left behind something more valuable than any amount of gold, a story that reminded future generations that love is always possible, that kindness matters, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply see another person's need and respond with an open heart. The mountain man and the plump maid, brought together by hunger and generosity, had created something that would outlast the mountains themselves, a legacy of love that would never be forgotten, passed down through time, generation after generation, ensuring that their story would live forever.